They've been described as the world's most persecuted people, unrecognized as citizens, and rejected by the country they call home.
The Rohingya have a disputed and contested identity in the sense that their claims to resources are not recognized by the authorities in charge.
The systematic campaign of violence that went on for decades have forced thousands of Rohingya to flee their homes in Myanmar's Rakhine state.
We could see villages are burning, we could see people shot, stabbed.
Almost 1 million Rohingya are now living as refugees in Coxs Bazaar, Bangladesh, to escape the terrifying violence. But the overcrowded camps and catastrophic living conditions have made them vulnerable to fires and disease outbreaks, prompting calls for them to be relocated to an offshore remote island called Bhasan Char. Is Basan Char a permanent solution to the problem facing the Rohingya community? And a year after the military coup in Myanmar, is there any hope left for them to return home? Or are they destined to remain stateless forever? On a cool, sleepy Sunday, just before the people gathered to perform their asa or the afternoon prayer, a tragedy struck the refugee camps in Coxs Bazaar, Bangladesh. Loud, piercing screams filled the air as panicked residents scurried frantically to escape a massive blaze which ripped through the overcrowded camps. Thick, black plumes of smoke blocked out the skies, turning the settlement into an apocalyptic sea of fire. 25-year-old Rohingya refugee Abida was among those who witnessed the unspeakable horrors as the fire engulfed large swaths of land, destroying thousands of homes and makeshift shelters in the process. Within minutes, row upon row of shanty huts, propped up by bamboo poles, were engulfed in flames. The fire spread uncontrollably and continued to burn for hours, leaving the Rohingya completely powerless as they witnessed whatever little they had left collapsing right before their eyes. No deaths were reported in the latest incident, but over 1,000 homes were gutted by the fire. Thankfully, it was a minor injury and both mother and child are safe. But not everyone is as fortunate. In March last year, another tragic fire killed 15 people and left more than 10,000 families homeless. 35-year-old Dila Begum is one of the homeless victims. The widow said her husband died of illness in Myanmar some years back, but she has no recollection about the nature of his illness or how he died. During the Myanmar military's brutal crackdown against the Rohingya in 2017, Dilla managed to escape to Bangladesh by the skin of her teeth, along with 7 young children, only to lose a few of them to the horrific fire a few years later.
Tufan Bafutan Hazanasi, Bafut Bazi. Itara Beguna, Duri Daria, Nelizairu, Kagilamuyo. Ekazagera Bade, Dujan Hazigilwi, Amato Makatal Anguriguriera, Tuaka, Iba Hazigil, Tinjong Hazigil.
Coxs Bazar is home to the largest refugee camp in the world. Since the massive 2017 exodus of the Rohingya from Myanmar to Bangladesh, more than 1 million people live in the cramped, dusty, and overcrowded makeshift shelters made of bamboo and tarpaulin canvas. The United Nations has described the Rohingya as the most persecuted minority in the world. Despite living in Myanmar for many generations, the Rohingya are not recognized as an official ethnic group and have been denied citizenship, making them the world's largest stateless population.
Statelessness usually means that a community of people have no connection to the resources, to the services, to the protection, to the laws, to the promise of opportunities that the state or those who are leading, the institutions that are leading a country can provide for them. And the challenge for these people, of course, are what are they going to do? Where are they going to live? Who's going to take care of their children? Who's going to take care of themselves? Where are they going to get their jobs? Especially if their own sense of citizenship is not recognized by anyone.
After being hunted and driven out of their land and homes in Rakhine state by the Myanmar army, the displaced community is now living in the sprawling camps along the unstable hillsides in Bangladesh known as Coxs Bazar. The flood-prone region can turn entire fields into waterlogged puddles, and roofs leak easily, especially during the rainy season.
It's kind of hard to imagine, but rivers of mud and people trying to live and use the bathroom and eat all on top of each other. And since then, because of the UN efforts and the international community's efforts and the hosting of the Bangladesh government, you have essentially like a vast camp of 1 million people living and surviving as well as they can. So while things have improved materially, perhaps psychologically, they may be deteriorating because they're not seeing any end to this particular misery.
As the day fades away and slips into the night, the future of the Rohingya refugees in Cox's Bazar has become even more uncertain. Every sunset brings a promise of a new dawn. Unfortunately, that does not seem to be the case for the Rohingya refugees. Every day, they're fighting just to exist, survive, and to be recognized as citizens. Khalida Begum, for one, has been staying in the camp for almost 5 years now. She has an elderly husband and a son who's wheelchair-bound. Each passing day is marked by prayers, followed by a small meal in between, and the sequence is repeated till nightfall. The bleak cycle begins all over again at the crack of dawn. Even as the depressing reality weighs down on the Rohingya community, A huge burden is also being felt by the Bangladeshi government. It has the unenviable task of hosting and providing humanitarian assistance to the fast-growing Rohingya population. Frustrations have been building over time in Bangladesh. Hosting more than 1 million people and shouldering the financial load of providing shelter, food, and water to the refugees is not an easy task in view of Bangladesh's own resource constraints.
Well, we have invested billions. I mean, that's pre-2017. I'm sure the aggregate figure will cross well above $1 billion mark. This problem is going to explode. I mean, the current situation in the camp is even more horrific. It is the gun running and drug trafficking is everyday affair, and that's impacting the rest of the nation.
So what is the crux of the problem facing the Rohingya community? Why are they unwanted and unrecognized as citizens in their own land? It was only in late 2016 that the violence and persecution against the Rohingya started to gain global attention. It began with the coordinated assaults by a small group of Rohingya militants on the police patrol guards. 9 policemen were killed in the attacks, but it quickly escalated into uncontrolled violence. The retribution by the state, however, was swift and brutal.
After the provocation that they created led to a hugely disproportionate response, where the military decided to take any person they saw as being Rohingya and try to expel or even kill them as a sort of member of a terrorist organization.
The Myanmar military began a vicious, scorched earth campaign against the Rohingya, burning down entire villages occupied by the ethnic minority, in what's been described by the United Nations as a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. Media reports stated that thousands of Rohingya, men, women, and children were arrested, tortured, and killed. The systematic campaign of arson and killings sent hundreds of thousands of traumatized Rohingya fleeing across the border into Bangladesh.
We could see villages are burning. We could see people shot, stabbed. Newborn babies. Mothers are carrying their newborn babies and claiming that a husband is lost or killed. How long you can just wait on them and push them back or send them back home and tell them do not cross the boundary? We cannot possibly see that thousands of people are shot dead in our border. That's the reason we opened the border, and in first 17 days alone, we received over 500,000.
Muhammad Hashim still remembers the horrors that unfolded as if it happened just yesterday. He witnessed with his own eyes how the Myanmar military brutalized his fellow Rohingya. Hashim himself was being hunted down as he ran from one burnt-out village to the next. He finally arrived in Coxs Bazaar on foot after 4 days of perilous journey into Bangladesh.
কুরবান মানে অগস্ট 2017 মানে কুরবানির ঈদর মানে 5 দিন আগে এদুর পর্যন্ত মনে আছে কেঙ্গুরে আসি মানে যে তোমাদের ফারাম মাঝে আছে তারা ও তো হেলিকপ্টার আই যে তোমাদের ভূমকল আছে ডালে দি ফেলের আরাদা আছে আর হেদুর মাঝে আছে ফারার গানো জালি ফেলাই বললাম হইতে আছে মানে আরাদা আছে মানে থিয়ে এসেছিলাম ফারাত তাই ফেজুম বলি গরত তাই ফেজুম বলি আমি হইতে আছে মাহবুন বেগুন সরমান নেলা দি বলাই থাকি এসেছিলাম ফিসুত সরকারের হালতরে দেশ আমাদের বেশি খারাপ 10,000 ইয়ান বুঝি ভারিয়ে আছে মানে তোলা তুলিরে যে তোমাদের মানুষ বেগুন শাক করে ফটো করে ফেলাই হাড়ি ফেলাই যে তোমার পুরা দি ফেলাই এই যে আরারিয়ে নরাকিব হল্লাং হইতে সাদুলস্তর আসছি সাদুলস্তর হই দিয়ে আনলে আছে বুইসের হই দিয়ে আনলে একই গ্রাম একই ভাড়া তো উত্তর মাথার তো যত মাঝে ফুরা দিয়া শুরু করছে বাদে আছে দূর মানে আরা হালজা পুরা এর দাস আরা হদিলা আর হালর ফসিন কুলা কদা আইসর হইয়ান ফারা এর দাস আরা আইসরের কুলা এর দাসে এর একটা কিলাম তো তারপর দিন যত মা ফারা আরা গাম ফুরা দি ফেলাই আর ফর দাস আরা আগি গি দিরিয়া
Although the Rohingya crisis grabbed global headlines in 2017 due to the brutal atrocities committed by the Myanmar military, what's little less known is that the persecution of the Rohingya dates back to the 1970s. There were two crises that happened before 2017. In the late 1970s, Burma conducted a population census called Operation Dragon King in a bid to drive out what the majority Burmese defined as foreigners. Some 200,000 Rohingya fled to Bangladesh.
The 1978 operations was called Nagamin, which means like Great Dragon, basically, or Dragon King, and it was designed as a sort of immigration roundup. And it was designed to remove illegal people from being in the country.
In 1979, Burma accepted the return of the Rohingya refugees and a truce was in place. But the peace did not last long. In 1988, political turmoil rocked Burma again. The military regime then launched a brutal crackdown against pro-democracy demonstrators, killing some 3,000 people. Violence against the Rohingya was further intensified, and some 300,000 escaped to Bangladesh. In 2017, history repeated itself.
We have these humanitarian catastrophes that exploded in 2017. I mean, meanwhile, let me just remind you that there were exodus in 2016. We actually received 65,000 Rohingyas and sheltered them here. And we obviously never imagined in wildest of our imagination that we will have another 700,000 in a couple of months. So that was August 25th, 2017.
The influx in 2017 was a very large one. In a matter of weeks following August, over 700,000 refugees fled from Myanmar, neighboring Bangladesh, and found refuge in this country. This was the largest population movement in the region since Bangladesh's own liberation war.
So what is it about the Rohingya that makes them one of the most persecuted and unwanted people on earth?
The British, they ruled what is now Myanmar and what is now India as if it was one great big province. So there was a lot of immigration at that time, and many Bengalis were brought into Myanmar to work in rice cultivation. And so the narrative from Myanmar nationalist perspective is that all Rohingya came with the colonial imposition and the colonial migration of peoples, ignoring the fact that there were many of the people, what I might call the proto-Rohingya, who had existed there already.
One of the often cited reasons for hostility between the Rohingya and the majority ethnic Burmese in Myanmar is religion. The Rohingya are Muslims, while the majority Burmese are Buddhists. However, experts believe that religion is just a convenient excuse for long-standing racism. The main bone of contention is economics and the struggle for limited resources.
The issue is not just limited to religious differences. I think that's just what's used after the fact. I think what's happening is that you've had 50, 60 years of civil war. You've had a lack of investment into these areas. People are suffering. They need jobs. They need health care. They need hope. They need opportunities. And when those who are living in these areas come into contact with others who want the same thing, these differences can become the basis for really the ugly side of humanity. And people will start then competing for the same resources, even though they were neighbors and good friends before. These sorts of situations unfortunately cause terrible violence, as we've seen, over the last decade.
Since post-colonial Burma in 1948, the Rohingya have been excluded from any national conversation as they are not regarded as Burmese citizens. In 1948 and 1962, Burma issued national identity cards to more than 100 ethnic groups. Both times, the Rohingya were excluded.
The struggle with identity, of course, is when you have certain groups who have certain ideas about who they are as a community, when they differ with other groups who perhaps live in the same land or are trying to claim the same resources or claim certain rights to, say, produce or living and so forth. And so the Rohingya have a disputed and contested identity in the sense that their claims to resources are not recognized by the authorities in charge. And they are said to not belong to either the nation state of Myanmar or to the nation state of Bangladesh, or perhaps even to other communities farther within the northeastern part of India.
The 1982 Citizenship Act sealed the fate of the Rohingya. The law officially categorized them as foreigners in their own land. In effect, the Rohingya have no state to call their own.
The citizenship law is explicitly racist. It does declare that you had to have been one of the national races in the country. They weren't allowed to make their case because they were made to procure and present documentation that they didn't have. Because, recall, the Rohingya had been citizens, and so they didn't have any of the documentation that goes back hundreds of years to prove that they belonged in the country.
And being stateless comes with terrible consequences. They are shut out of critical access and opportunities to some of the most basic necessities in life: the right to healthcare, education, jobs, property ownership, and the right to self-advancement and progress. Ehsan Ullah was just 12 years old when he barely escaped death from the constant bombardments of his village in Rakhine state by the Burmese military. The young boy witnessed with his own eyes the cold-blooded murders and violence committed in his village.
Burman military hot literary military gorfradi rebuje Burman military আর মানুষ 60
তে Burman military হজন আছে
বেশি আছে তারা Burman military 1400 ইন্ডিয়া বেশি বুং মাঝে Burman আর রেব গজে Burman military গরুবতর গজে
Ehsan's precious teenage years were spent growing up in the refugee camp. He helps out at a grocery store and sells snacks to eke out a living. Now, at 17, his ambition is to become a doctor one day so that he can help his people. But with little access to education, his dream will not be any closer to reality.
পান্না হরিম লেখাপড়া করিম তারপর ডাক্তার বনিম ডাক্তার বনি মাঝে কোমরে দাবাই করিম আর মাঝে সিল বালা করে হাই হয়ে বালা করে সেল হয়ে পান্না হরিম বালা করে কি তাইতাম বলি আর এর বালা করে পান্না ফুটতে নজর হন বাংলাদেশ সরকারের ফুটতে নজর বালা করে হন
52% of the over 900,000 Rohingya refugees in the countries are children below the age of 18. Some of them have access to education through learning centers, but not all of them. The importance for refugees while they are in Bangladesh is to have access to learning, because learning gives hope, but learning also gives them the ability to build a future when they return home in Myanmar, which they overwhelmingly have said they want to.
Living in cramped, overcrowded conditions over a long period of time is simply not sustainable. And so the Bangladesh government initiated the multi-million-dollar Bhasan Char Island project, a purpose-built facility for the relocation of the Rohingya from Coxs Bazar.
It's far better arrangements Then in Coxs Bazaar, if you look at the kind of infrastructure that was built, the kind of settlement, even for the children to play.
But why is the Bhasan Char Island project being resisted by the Rohingya refugees? Is Bhasan Char really the answer to the Rohingya crisis? It's a day like any other day in the life of the refugees here in Coxs Bazaar, the world's largest refugee camp. For 37-year-old Khaleda Begum, she starts her day drawing water at the communal pipes located just a few hundred meters away from her tent. Water is a scarce resource here in the overcrowded and squalid tent cities. Each person is allowed to draw only 20 liters of water per day. And Khaleda would try to get the most out of the precious water she gets. She would use it for drinking, cooking, laundry, cleaning, and her personal hygiene and sanitation. But she spends most of her free time praying or reading the holy text.
Pasir pelu pelu no bolle adi bari hai panshan azugurji jikka manoy kazagoi to zura andela panma sora bore pasir para bore area bazede edur halatiri.
Khaleda has a young disabled son to keep her busy throughout the day. Every day, she would have to attend to all his personal needs, including cleaning and putting on clothes for him. Once that is settled, Khaleda gets busy in the kitchen to cook for her family. She can't rely on her husband to lighten her load, as he's old and too frail to do much. Living in a cramped and dangerously overcrowded camp with her disabled son and an elderly spouse can be very challenging. The incidents of fires that occurred in the camps ever so often have made her continued stay in the refugee settlement even more untenable. Recently, Khaleda has been offered a glimmer of hope for more space and freedom of movement. But only if she's willing to leave her current camp in Coxs Bazaar. Her family is among those who have been selected to move to a remote island known as Basan Char.
It's an island called Bhasan Char, and we have invested so far $350 million, and that will house only about 99,000 Rohingyas. So that's barely 1/10 of the total population of Rohingyas. We have people who volunteered to move. So far the number is 19,000, and during winter we will plan to shift more. So we are inviting Rohingyas and encouraging them, someone who raises their hand, they are the one who will be shifted.
The Basancha Island project was first mooted by the Bangladesh government in 2015. The authorities are well aware of the frustrations that have been building up among the Rohingya community over the years. The overcrowded and unsanitary conditions in the camps, job opportunities that are few and far between, and there's simply no future in Coxs Bazaar. This pent-up anger and frustration could well be a recipe for disaster. Finally, after almost 4 years of uncertainty, relocation to Basancha Island has now picked up momentum. In December 2020, some 1,600 Rohingya from Coxs Bazaar were shipped to the island. Media access to Basancha Island is restricted. Although the Bangladeshi government has come under fire from humanitarian groups about the alleged safety of the remote, cyclone-prone waters of Bhasan Char, the exclusive footage that we received from Rohingya residents tells a different story. Facilities created on the 13,000-acre island include 1,400 cluster homes, 120 cyclone shelters, schools, 2 hospitals, mosques, as well as paved roads and drainage systems.
If you look at the arrangements, it's far better arrangements than in Coxs Bazaar. If you look at the kind of infrastructure that was built, the kind of settlement, even for the children to play, where in the Coxs Bazar camps you hardly have space for the children to play, the kind of education that's required.
Despite the promises of better living environment in Basan Char, Khalida remains unconvinced due to the negative rumors which have been swirling around. And now she's having second thoughts about moving there. Muhammad Kashim was one of the early volunteers who have been relocated to Basan Char. And he has good things to say about the island compared to where he used to stay in Coxs Bazar.
এটা সুন্দর করে চলি হইলে না হারার এটা চলি হই পারিবা তাই তোমার আর হেডে গেলে মানে কি দোয়ানদারা কল দি দিব হেন্দিলা সদরি গরি পারিবা হাল গরি পারিবা গরু চল ফালি পারিবা এল্লা হই হ্যান সিয়াসি তরফত হই
But Kashim returned to Cox's Bazaar because, according to him, of food shortage.
Bison salt cannot dia, tu jadi cannot dia.
I gilam devela mani.
I Basan Char gesi, ei bhabe shuru.
I Basan Char gilam devela. Tonki sota shil. Emmash ration ziba de. Iba emmash foro de. Emmash mother ration দিয়ে এবার তারপরে মাসে ঘুরে 10-15 দিন হয়ে যাবে মানুষ শৈলকল ফুরে যাবে খাদ্য ফুরে যাবে এই আল্লাহর মানুষ তো দারু দার লয়ের কি করা করে চলা করি
তো অনেক খেয়াল লাউন তো অফিস আগে বেজে
বাইসন সর তো ও অফিস আগে গিয়ে হ্যাঁ শান্তি হইল কিন্তু কেডা অশান্তি টিয়া পয়সা হামাই না পারে
Stories like Kashim's are scaring away the Rohingya from going to Basan Char. It doesn't inspire confidence, especially in view of earlier controversies surrounding the relocation efforts. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR, and other rights groups had questioned the safety of the flood and cyclone-prone island. Stuck in the middle of the sea, it could be submerged during high tides, a view which has been vehemently rejected by the Bangladesh government.
It was very frustrating, and no harm saying that it started off with a very wrong perception of one of the highly placed UN officials. I mean, she's no longer with UN, but obviously that set the tone. But what we did is we didn't lose patience. Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's directive to us was that you remain engaged and take them there. And seeing is believing. And even though there were a lot of negative press about it, but I'm glad to report to our viewers through Channel News Asia and to yourself is that United Nations is finally convinced, and so is the international organizations and our friendly countries, or everyone. No one actually objected, but it was wrongly portrayed initially.
The UN, through UNHCR, signed a memorandum of understanding with the Bangladeshi government in October last year to establish the modality for the UN to operate on Basan Char. This memorandum of understanding was a recognition of the prevailing humanitarian and protection needs of the refugees who had been relocated on the island. Relocation of refugees on the island is an initiative by the Bangladeshi government. UN and UNHCR is supporting the government in responding to the needs of the refugees who have been relocated to the island.
The Bhasan Char controversy has now mostly blown over. The UNHCR delegation has been on site several times since and have set up operations on the island to support the Rohingya. However, the Bhasan Char Island project wasn't and isn't meant to be a permanent solution to the plight of the Rohingya. The Bangladesh government has always been very clear about their intention.
গরফরে দিয়ে বর্মা মিলিটারি বুম মারিয়ে
জায়গান করে পারি আমি আম ভাবি যাই বানা আর কিছু না ভাবি
However, since the military coup in February last year, Myanmar is now on the brink of civil war. Will that dampen all hopes for a safe and dignified return of the Rohingya community to Myanmar? Is home in Myanmar for the Rohingya nothing more than an elusive dream? It has been 1 year since the Myanmar military overthrew the quasi-civilian government led by democracy icon and leader of the National League for Democracy, Aung San Suu Kyi. All the anti-government protests that broke out soon after the military takeover on February 1st last year have all but disappeared. Today, the streets in the capital Yangon are eerily quiet. But elsewhere, in the border regions and in the heartlands, fierce fighting is taking place between government forces and the armed ethnic groups who are sheltering thousands of anti-military dissidents. The regime is now facing armed conflicts on multiple fronts, pushing the country to the brink of civil war. Amidst the chaos and political turmoil, there's something positive that had come out of it, especially for 50-year-old Rohingya Solim Ullah. He was released rather unexpectedly from prison in Rakhine state just after the coup in February last year. To his own surprise, he said it was the military's decision to pardon him. Solim then took the chance to escape to Bangladesh to join his wife and children in Coxs Bazar.
Barma military ana thing jede mana ana lofille de power lofille de February mare ya one hore
ya ana lofille ba de military ara na gondo dire logo jede
logo jede da ona era shada hon mashat
July mashat hada ara jaga do binara jelhana to lo feje April mashat 7 tarikh April মাসে 7 তারিখ মালো কইয়া আর বিড়া বাড়ি তাছি আর অনসান সুশির বাবুতে আসিলে ইও অনসান সুশির রাত আসিলে হিয়া আর মিলিটারি বেশি জুলুম যদি ইয়া মিলিটারি আর আলই বাদ দেশ মার রোহিঙ্গা আছে দেখিন রে হেদু সাব নদ মিসাতা হইন তারা পালাই গো যেতে তালা আর আই হই যদি আপনারা 16 বছর ধরে জেল মাজিল অস্ত যদি নাকি ননদের হইলে আর তো 16 বছর জেল হেডা আর আল্লাহর হুকুমে মরে যাবে
Solim has mixed feelings about the military leaders in Myanmar. While he owes his current freedom to them, the military is also responsible for all the atrocities against the Rohingya. But there's one thing that Solim and almost all of the Rohingya refugees share in common. All of them want to return home.
All surveys showed almost bulk of them, and it would be more than 98%, they want to go back. Nobody wants to stay in a refugee camp. But this time I think the difference is, since crime against humanity or genocide took place, so there's a bigger trauma this time. And so this time they want a solution on the issue of identity, and that means citizenship. I don't think they want to go back again on the same principle, okay, we take you back and then we'll think about your identity and all. I don't think Rohingyas would do that this time.
The reality, however, is far more complicated than a simple hope and a wish to return home. Talks between Myanmar and Bangladesh for the return of the Rohingya has been going on for decades. But there hasn't been any significant breakthrough in talks between the Bangladeshi and Myanmar governments to bring the refugees home. Meanwhile, the fate of 1 million refugees still in Cox's Bazar remains uncertain.
But we still believe, because the last repatriation that took place in 1991 and 1992, it was military government in Myanmar. But this one is still very confusing, honestly speaking. We have submitted a list of over 800,000 Rohingyas with their identities, addresses of the village. We have agreed a set procedure, keeping UN in the middle. But unfortunately, they have only reacted on 42,000 odd cases, and they have cleared about 24,000 cases. But yes, you are right that it stalled since the military took over.
One solution which has been put forth is for Bangladesh to grant a more permanent status to the Rohingya, and that would mean extending citizenship rights to them. But experts we spoke to have strongly objected to this. Any such thought will only mean letting off the perpetrators of the violence without any responsibility or accountability.
When a genocide takes place or when a crime against humanity takes place, it no longer remains bilateral. You need to resolve the issue. It's not Bangladesh giving citizenship or a third country settlement, because what would happen, then you are helping the Myanmar military to do what they have done and what they want. So you would be supporting, or you would be complicit to the genocide. That's the problem. Anyone suggesting that they should settle in Bangladesh or in Canada or in Australia, for God's sake, they are not really thinking seriously on the issue.
No, there's absolutely no chance. We started off, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's government came back power for the second time in 2009, where we had 45% of our population was living below the poverty line. But we have another still 20+% living below the poverty line, and we have a lot of work to be done with our own population. And it is absolutely down to Myanmar. This problem was created by Myanmar, solution lies with Myanmar.
I Bangladesh क्या बांग्लादेश आरार जागा तो बिना आरार बिड़ा बारी जागा तो बिना से आरार एडे मूल्य आरार एडे मीडिया है आरार एडे नता आरार तो आरार जागा तो बिना आरार बिड़ा बारी आरार माल जोलो तो ला आरार तो 24 घंटा एडे सूरी मारी फैलाई लो दो एडे फटफुरी एडे चुं खुरमा फुलो हाइले दो एडे कम ना लगे आरार तो क्या है नहीं दे बात बना शुदा बात खाइले दो बहुत गन्नी दर जिहाँ तो यहाँ नहीं माना रद्द बोले आरार बात दादा हेडे आरार बाप हेडे आरार नाना हेडे बेकुन हेडे
आरा बांग्लादेश मानी लोले खुद ना था कि मैं बर्मा जाबेला या कुछ आर के सुनो
बर्मा जाइते से आरार हक काम जो आरार सेफ्टी जो सिक्योरिटी देते कि आरार हक काम जो आरार फायदे कि आरार एखनो जाइए आरार ताइते न से.
In November 2019, Myanmar was taken to the International Court of Justice, or the ICJ. It has been accused of genocide against the Rohingya. In January 2020, the ICJ then issued an order to the Myanmar government to immediately seize any genocidal acts against the community. The ruling was an obvious win for the Rohingya cause.
ICJ, in their provisional judgment, they have agreed to the concept called Rohingya. They have agreed to the identity. And it was a unanimous decision. And you had a Myanmar judge also, and you had judge from India, you had judge from China, you had judge from Russia, you had judges from throughout the world, and they unanimously agreed to the identity called, or to the concept called Rohingyas. None of them had any debate on that.
Every country have ethnic diversities. I mean, even in Bangladesh or India or Pakistan or Singapore or Malaysia, I mean, very rarely that a country will have just one ethnicity. It's the diversity is the beauty, and we must realize and accept that. And Myanmar also, it's not only Rohingyas. They have multi-ethnic groups. They should accept the reality. They should engage. They should talk.
In reality, however, the needle hasn't moved an inch on the issue of when the Rohingya can return home. So it looks like they will continue to languish in overcrowded camps, deprived of all their rights, basic services, and necessities in life.
They live without the affordances of citizenship. In many cases not being able to go to school, not being able to work legally, and so this leads to a situation of kind of protracted liminality. And what I mean by that is they can't advance lives that allow them to flourish. They're stuck in a limbo perpetually. Their children can't go to school, so they can't get a better education. They can't pull themselves up and advance. They can't legally work, so they can't advance in the professions. So statelessness, obviously it is symbolically degrading to be told you don't belong to a state, but on a day-to-day level, it means that they really struggle.
The reality is, Myanmar is now in the throes of chaos and conflict. Granting citizenship rights to the Rohingya will not be of immediate concern to the military leaders.
In terms of priorities, the Myanmar government is probably going to be focusing on the 2023 elections that they have just announced. They're probably more concerned about the armed conflicts with the ethnic organizations. They're going to be focusing on COVID, and they're going to be focusing on the economy. And I don't think the repatriation issue is going to be at the top of the list.
And so, for now, the Rohingya will remain stuck in no man's land. Home for them has now become a distant memory. They don't exist on the land they live on, unseen and unheard as a people, rejected by their own government, and unrecognized as citizens of any state. If anything, they have now become the world's most unwanted people, and their future continues to look bleak.
And if the states don't want these people, then there is no easy solution for them. I don't want to say that they'll remain forever, but the situation is quite grim.